We'll begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which this event takes place and paying respects, of course, to elders past, present and emerging. And we'd also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are attending today. Today we have Dr. Jeremy Hayllar, who's the Clinical Director for the Alcohol and Drug Service. Jeremy will be presenting on the elephant in the room. And while the latest research might offer new insights into the field of alcohol and drugs, sometimes key messages from older pieces of work might be overlooked. So observe and listen closely today as Jeremy's presentation unfolds. There may be elephants in the room.
Thanks very much, Rod. So I'm trying to explore some of the elephants that we may not always consider in the room. I've thrown in a couple of pink elephants for amusement's sake, and finally a woolly mammoth towards the end.
Is that about the ice?
The ice epidemic? No. Thank you, Jim. I did a bit of calculation, and this is the 26th seminar that I've done here, so thanks for listening. And thank you, Chris. And based around 17 studies which have changed our work, and you'll see why I put that line in. So Genevieve Dingle came to talk to us about groups for health recently, and I was very struck by one of the papers she quoted from. So I thought I'd start there. Then we'll move on to the subject of opioid dependence, young people, education, a very controversial topic still, I think, with an interesting insight from Holland. Then back to the therapeutic relationship on which the whole edifice is constructed, I would hope to say. A bit about amphetamines, thank you, Jim. Alcohol use disorder, and of course, last but by no means least, tobacco. So some of the ideas and material have come from drug and alcohol findings, which comes from the old country. Professor Mike Ashton is the kind of inspiration behind it. And you can go on a mailing list which sends stuff out 2 or 3 times a week if you want, which refers to both recent and current journal articles with commentary and critiques, and also some stuff that they call old gold. And it's some of those old gold materials that I've used to prepare this talk. And when I was starting with this idea, I came across these 2 new books being added to the Prince Charles Library. So 50 imaging studies every doctor should know, and 50 studies every paediatrician should know. So they are using this same idea, looking at the formative studies that go back over time, which have turned the specialty the way it's now formed. So we're not alone here in trying to respect the past and consider those elephants. Of course, this quote is very meaningful, I think, at this time. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So if we know what's gone before, hopefully we'll operate better, though politicians rarely seem to take this adage to heart. Okay, so I thought for the first pink elephant, we'd talk about the war on drugs. Now there is a kind of elephant in the room that's enormous. Let's just look at what happened in the States in the 20th century. So regulation of substances began in 1914, start of the First World War, with a Narcotics Tax Act. Notice the revenue side, very important, and that remains relevant even to this day. Think of pokies and states becoming very reliant on income from pokies, which makes them very reluctant to interfere. In 1919, the 18th Amendment prohibited the sale, manufacture or transportation of alcohol. And it was only in 1933 the 21st Amendment came along that abolished prohibition. And generally prohibition is a bad way to do things. I think that's a very universal principle. In 1937, so for all this time marijuana was widely used and available. Another tax act, possibly to destroy hemp producers who were making paper, which competed with wood pulp from the big industrialists who own the newspapers, so they wanted to support their own industries and put the hemp people out of business. That's still somewhat speculative. Then we go to 1968, one of the most eminent presidents in US history, Nixon, formally declared the war on drugs. Eradication, interdiction and incarceration. Strong state action. John Ehrlichman, who was one of his advisors involved in the Watergate stuff, said really this was to enable us to fight two enemies at once, blacks and the anti-war lefts, also known as hippies. So this was a perfect way to target these two groups by declaring a war on drugs. In 1971, Nixon was quoted as saying, "Drug abuse is public enemy number one," really reflecting what was going on in Vietnam, which we'll come to in the next slide. And the press took hold of this, and it really became huge and a real concept that gripped the public, even though there were funds allocated both for prevention and rehabilitation for those who'd already fallen foul of drugs. Rather more generous funding than we perhaps see these days, so Nixon wasn't all bad. We now see that around $50 billion per year is spent by the US to further their war on drugs, and as the Global Commission was reported as saying in 2011, this has totally failed. So this paper comes from a presentation Genevieve Dingle did here recently, talking about groups for health. And I was really taken with it. I'll show you the slide of the influence of social networks on survival, but this highlighted bit of text: the medical profession was stunned to learn that infants would die without social interaction. Refers to practice in the early 20th century when in orphanages babies were just left alone. They were fed, but that was about it, and they didn't do very well. And the doctors were astonished that when you picked them up and nurtured them, they did much better. So this kind of very basic concept that we all recognise really only emerged when people started looking at outcomes and results and working out what seemed to help. So here's this amazing graph. So I know the print's very small, but social relationships high against low social support contrasted. And this is the lowering in relative risk of death. So a 60% reduction, more than 60%, for those in a high level of social support relationships compared with those in a low social support. Contrast that with smoking more than 15 cigarettes a day. It has a larger effect. Other influences on mortality here: flu vaccine, cardiac rehab, physical activity, BMI. So this social stuff's really big, isn't it? Yet we don't necessarily appreciate that in our day-to-day. I put it to you, this is an elephant in the room, and we're going to see some more as we go through. So back to Vietnam, and this was a study which followed up veterans returning from Vietnam for 3 years. That they interviewed them about 8 months after they came back from Vietnam, and then followed them up 3 years later. The background to this was there were lots of rumours of crazy stuff going on in Vietnam, so 2 congressmen were sent to Vietnam in March 1971 to investigate, and they discovered heroin was rife amongst their US soldiers, the GIs. So Jerome Jaffe, he urged, from a position of some influence and authority, he urged the Department of Defense to perform a urine drug screen on all returning soldiers from Vietnam. Evacuation started, I think, in September 1971. So before you could get on that plane, you had to have a negative UDS. If you had a positive result, you were referred into withdrawal treatment in Vietnam before you could return. And there's a story of a guy getting off a plane, going out to fight in Vietnam, meeting someone who was getting on the plane, who said, "Hey, if you give me your urine, I'll give you some heroin." So the guy trying to leave was trying to escape, and he was rewarding the new arrival who hadn't used heroin, and that sort of thing was obviously going on. And have things changed very much today? I put it to you, they haven't. So they then they recruited 900 out of 14,000 returnees who came back on one of those first sets of evacuation flights in September. And as well as randomly selected, they also took a random selection of those with positive urine drug screens. So they wanted to make sure they had enough of those, because before this time, big surveys in the States had yielded only very, very small numbers. So one survey of 2,500 adults produced only 20 who were using heroin. So it seems that heroin use was really quite uncommon. And so, as I said, 8 to 12 months later, these returnees, having been kind of selected here, they were then interviewed. So this study, Vietnam veterans, the lead was Lee Robbins, who's now died. This study was republished in 2010, you can see, but originally it was published in 1977. So 3 years later, in 1974, they re-interviewed 600 odd of the returnees. They didn't have enough money to get all 900 because they wanted to have some match controls who weren't veterans, hadn't been fighting. They got fantastic follow-up. So across the 3 years, they had a 91% follow-up rate, which, if you think of our follow-up rates in clinic, it's extraordinary. And these are some of the figures that came out. So 85% of the GIs arriving in Vietnam were offered heroin at some time. About a third used, and about a fifth became addicted. That's the phrase from the 1970s. And 3/4 of those who use more than 5 times became dependent. So that's a fairly high level of exposure. What was amazing, though, was what happened when these people came back from Vietnam. And that was the question they wanted to explore. And these were the preconceptions that informed their analysis. They wanted to know whether heroin use progressed rapidly to daily use and dependence. Is it so much more pleasurable than other substances that it supplants them? Is it a permanent state unless you have prolonged treatment? And does maintaining recovery require abstinence? So finally then, is heroin a major social problem? So what's really interesting is here's the progression to regular and daily use by users of 4 drugs over the last 2 years. So the users in Vietnam came back to the States and they were followed up. And what you can see is that 40% were using regularly. That means more than once a week for more than a month over those 2 years. And about 20% were using on a daily basis. However, compared with heroin, the amphetamine use and the marijuana use was more popular. So there were more people using those 2 substances. And I think on this graph here, we've slightly cut off the peaks there, I'm afraid. And you can see again, amphetamine and marijuana were more popular amongst heroin users. Now, part of this may, of course, be a poor quality supply in the US because the market in drugs was rather immature at that stage, whereas in Vietnam it said the quality of product was very, very good. So that may be part of what explains the greater popularity of marijuana and amphetamines in this group. And we can see the history here. BARB stands for barbiturates. So we're looking at not a pre-benzo era, but an era where benzos were gradually taking over from barbiturates. Is heroin so much more pleasurable than other substances that it supplants them? So in black here we've got the non-users, and in pale we've got the heroin users. And as you can see, once again, amphetamines, marijuana, barbiturates, they all come out well ahead of opium or narcotic use in both the non-users and the heroin users. So even in those regular users of heroin, their other use of other substances is very significant. So that idea of the sort of purity of the single substance and its dependence, we now talk about our polysubstance users. That was happening way back then. When they talked to users, they had on average used over 10 different substances in the previous 6 months, compared with 7 for the occasional heroin users. So it does seem that heroin use is a marker for using a wide range of substances more heavily than the non-regular user. And what about people getting better without treatment? Well, that certainly seems to be the case too. So only about 12% of those who had been using in Vietnam became re-addicted, that slightly odd word. And if you think of DSM-5, it covers what's happened in the previous 12 months. So it doesn't look back further than that, though we know that someone with a remote history of injection heroin or opioid use has a much higher risk of relapse, don't we? And we see that in clinics from time to time. Even though this group here, relatively small, were re-addicted, there were others who were using less often, who managed to maintain that sporadic use. That's, again, slightly counter what our understanding might have been. Now, of course, the more often you use, the more likely you are to be re-addicted. Nevertheless, of all those in Vietnam, only about 12% became re-addicted over those 3 years. And this is really discussing the same thing, saying that to maintain recovery, you really don't need to be fully abstinent, because there are some people here who are using sporadically who don't revert to addiction. The final question they wanted to answer was whether heroin was a major social problem, and I think we can see marked difference between those with heroin dependence, and even though they had 900 men to begin with, there's a relatively small number here who were the ongoing heroin dependent people. So much less employment status, much greater likelihood of being unemployed or in part-time sporadic work, and much more likely to have had time out of work. Even so, more than 50% of the heroin users would have been in employment for 12 months or so of the previous 2 years. Much more criminal activity, property crime and so forth. This is one of the ways in which opioid treatment is said to benefit the community as a whole, because it reduces the risk of property crime. So that conveniently segues into opioid treatment, and the two doctors in New York who developed the idea of methadone maintenance, Niswander, and we'll come to her husband with the next slide. So it was early in 1964, so before the returnees were coming back from Vietnam. She gave methadone to 2 patients on the ward, and in those days they admitted heroin users for quite long spells, and they didn't treat them with opioids at all, so they were naturally climbing the walls. She describes how their behaviour changed. They got up, got dressed, and started going to night school. She describes waiting in total terror every night for her charges to return to the ward, because she was fearful that they would go and try and score. Instead of scoring heroin, they went and scored ice cream. Dole and Niswander developed this and published the paper in 1970, and their original paper, which has been reprinted and it does repay reading, was 22 patients, and their principles were high dose, intense rehabilitation, and extended treatment. And then Vincent Dole was heartbroken. I watched in despair as opinionated theorists distorted a patient-oriented, individualized treatment, lowered the dose, and punished the addicts for failure. So where do we sit between the Dole and Niswander model and the kind of punishing the addicts for being dependent? Where do we sit? Are we in the middle? Are we at one end of the spectrum? Or are we at the other end of the spectrum? Right, another pink elephant, harm reduction here in Australia. Since Bob Hawke and the drug summit in, I think, 1985, his daughter was a heroin user, I believe. That's often what gets things happening, as we know. There's really been lip service paid to the harm reduction, one of the 3 pillars of harm minimization overall. And although there's a very strong economic case, often politics and prejudice win the argument. So let's look at ROI, return on investment, in NSPs. It's about $27 for each dollar invested, from the ROI report number 2 in 2009. So relatively small amounts invested per year in NSPs around the country have saved billions, literally. Opioid treatment, there are varying figures that I've seen between $4 and $40. NIDA suggests about $12 return for every dollar spent. The medically supervised injection clinic in Sydney, $32 return on investment per dollar spent from the one of a number of reports done before the status was finally confirmed by law, rather than being a kind of trial, which was one of the longest trials because no politician dared to touch it. I tried to find some data on NSP in prison or opioid treatment in prison, and I couldn't find any, but one suspects that there would be a favourable evaluation. Perhaps I should have looked at the practice in Iran. They would no doubt have some good economic data about their results in Iranian prisons. Finally, naloxone distribution, take-home naloxone. Pranoxid is the new product, which is now available on the PBS or over the counter. So this material came from a thing called DrugNet in Ireland. They trained up 400 people to be aware of naloxone, gave out 95 scripts. They had 5 overdoses. So they made a profit, as it were, of 62,000 euros on their investment. So I can't quite give you the amount for each euro or dollar spent, but it certainly seems a positive net balance. Just looking at expenditure on the 3 pillars of harm minimisation in Australia. This is data from Alison Ritter. In total, $1.69 billion, almost 2/3 of which is spent on law enforcement. I recently went to an ICE summit in Rockhampton, attended by the Premier, the Health Minister, the Communities Minister, and what really shocked me was the number of short pale blue shirts present, all wearing arms. So there were probably 20 or 25 police officers in the assembled gathering. So let us not lose sight of a huge law and order thrust that continues in this field, where it's very difficult to show benefits influencing the price or the availability of illicit drugs on the street. Obviously, whenever there's a seizure made, it's trumpeted, and remember when the Bali 9 were intercepted at Denpasar Airport, the head of the federal police said, "We've saved 9,000 overdose deaths." Well, complete rubbish. There aren't 9,000 overdose deaths in Australia in any one year, and so the benefits are grossly inflated, and we really need to attend to the reality much more closely. Treatment services, they come in second, a long way behind. Prevention services, even further behind. And then finally, harm reduction. Barely an afterthought. It really is quite salutary, isn't it? So let's go to Holland. Generally one feels an enlightened country, though they did defeat their right-wing political candidate recently, I think. And drug education in young people. The orthodoxy at the time, this was in the 1970s, if you tell kids how dangerous these drugs are, they will say, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly, they're too dangerous." So if the parents' projections onto their children are put into effect, then that'll solve the problem. Now this guy, we'll see on the next slide, had the vision to arrange a really quite impressive study for those times. They took sample schools with a total of over 1,000 pupils aged 14 to 16. They had 3 regimes and a control group, very important. The first 2 regimes were one-shot approaches to inoculate the kids. So if you scare them badly enough, then they would never go near drugs. So the one was the mild horror approach, and the other one was scare them with information, show them how bad it is, how all your teeth will fall out and you'll overdose and all the rest. The third group were given, admittedly, 10 one-hour classes with their own teachers to discuss the problems of adolescence. So not a drug focus, using their own teachers, not getting someone to stand in front of them and lecture them, using the sort of classroom format with a familiar environment. And the fourth group, the 4 schools, had no intervention at all. They were the control group. And I'm sure this educated and esteemed audience will guess what the result was. Oh, here we are. So sorry, the Dehees and Sherman. They then followed people up for 3 months. Interestingly, those in group 2 remedy the knowledge, so information, had retained nothing of what they were told. And none of the 3 approaches deterred those who were already using. It was mainly cannabis, and we know Holland's been fairly loose about controlling cannabis for a long time. In non-users at the time of the intervention, the mild horror approach, 7.3% had started using in the next 3 months, compared with 4.6% of the controls and 2.6% of the unfocused group with their teacher. And if we look at that graphically, those given the warning, much higher rates of use. Those with the personal problem, adolescence, it's also painful, teacher, they were having less substance use compared with the controls. So it's fascinating because it's kind of produced a 180 degrees turnaround. Warning kids of the dangers of things is dangerous in itself because it's likely to entice them. They want to explore and test their limits. And it went, at the time, 180 degrees against the prevailing wisdom. So parents were scared, therefore their kids would be scared too. Now, we kind of take it for granted that these approaches aren't helpful. In the US, of course, they're immune from that because meth check is still very popular. That's showing the rotting teeth and all the other hideous facial consequences of using meth and so forth. So even when we've got good evidence to support appropriate educational approaches, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be taken up, sadly. Bill Miller, lovely quote here. In 1993, a good counsellor needed a loud voice and an arsenal of 4-letter words. So that takes us to Miller and Rolnick, enhancing motivation for change in problem drinking, a control comparison of 2 therapist styles. So they used the drinkers' checklist to recruit heavy drinkers. They had a 2-hour assessment with either immediate or 6 weeks later feedback. And the first group reduced their alcohol by about a quarter over the next 18 months. So reasonably good follow-up and a significant change as a result of the intervention. They then examined 2 ways of giving the feedback, either in a directive or confrontational way, or empathic, the touchy-feely stuff that some people can be quite scathing about. The empathic approach gave a slight reduction in drinking. When they looked more closely at their data, they found that the more confrontational the therapist was with the patient, the more that patient would be drinking a year later. Isn't that fascinating? So having a row with your therapist will likely enhance your drinking 12 months on. So that's a pretty salutary lesson, I think. I think finding those ingredients in what the therapist, the counsellor does and what the patient does is still, we're at the early stages of really trying to understand it. So this paper by Cartwright, published in 1980, was looking at what the qualities of the workers in the alcohol and drug field, what they brought to the table when they were seeing patients. And they had 3 groups. One went to summer school for a week, one went on a counselling course, and one did a research methods course in alcohol and drug. And they didn't have the greatest follow-up. Over half did all 3 questionnaires over the subsequent 6-month follow-up. And the factors that seemed to predict most the commitment of the worker and their ability to be effective were receiving support in the workplace and experience, which counted for more than formal education, though we like to see people with qualifications, don't we, than personality and the influence of the workplace. So the alcohol treatment centre study, which we've got going downstairs, will be a very useful follow-up for this kind of work to try and tease out the threads of what gives a successful outcome for our patients. So this is another reminiscence about the 50s, showing the change in portion size for fast foods. I got this from the BMJ a couple of years ago. So what we see with soda is we've gone from 7 ounces to 42 ounces. For hamburgers, 3.9 ounces to 12 ounces. From French fries, 2.4 ounces to 6.7 ounces. Sorry, we're not in grams here. And likewise, massive increases in portion sizes, even from the 90s up until the present time. So we're, in terms of calories, no wonder we're all getting fatter. A way to avoid getting fat is to use amphetamines, but it's not recommended. This was a psychiatrist at the Maudsley in London who did his MD thesis on amphetamine psychosis. And there's some debate about the use of this term because it may be more helpful to call it amphetamine intoxication. This reflects a turf war in emergency departments between whether mental health or whether ED should be trying to manage these patients. And the jury's still out, I think. So 42 oral amphetamine users detail mental health, alcohol and drug history. A lot of them had been hospitalised. Sorry, they were all in hospital. And the reasons included violence, suicidality, and requests for police protection, which is a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? You don't find many amphetamine-intoxicated people knocking on the doors of the police station saying, please help. They'd usually be running in the opposite direction. Perhaps it's the UK police, the Bobby on the beat there. They wouldn't harm a soul, would they? Did you have Dixon of Dock Green out here? Dreadful series. Perhaps some of you weren't born then, but yeah, anyway. So 12 reported being chased, 10 had other persecutory delusions, and the majority of cases followed prolonged drug use, though often they'd... The Queen visited Australia in 1954, so just a couple of years before this, and this was the vehicle that she was in. It looked a bit better in those days. People are trying to crowdfund repairs and rehabilitation. So it was called a Daimler Landaulet. Bizarre, isn't it? So 21% of their patients developed psychosis or a psychotic reaction after a single dose or a large dose divided over a 3-day period. Most recovered within 6 to 7 days. Some, it was more protracted. So, some very wise word. Treatment should be withdrawal of the drug and appropriate sedation. If symptoms persist beyond a few weeks, reassess for possible underlying illness and consider a trial of treatment with an antipsychotic. So, pretty much what we try and do now. Now we're getting on to alcohol. Mark Shuckett. He's worked for 25 years before he wrote this paper, trying to untangle genes and environment, how they interact to produce the risk of becoming alcohol dependent. So they followed up 450 men prospectively from 1975, so a 20-year follow-up, and they only lost 3, which is again amazing. So family history positive and family history negative. What they found, these were all at about 20 when they were first tested. They divided into low and high responders, and I'll show you on the next slide what we mean by responders. So 40% of those with a positive family history were low responders, whereas only 10% of the negative family histories. They were all white males, and they were case matched for alcohol consumption, employment status, and no mental health issues to confuse. So what we can see is a negative responder is someone based on serum cortisol, the subjective feeling of intoxication, and the body sway, so a more objective determination of intoxication. They were kind of immune to some level from the effects of alcohol, which means they would be likely drinking more to achieve some end result, compared with the people without the positive family history who were more sensitive to the effects of alcohol, so more body sway, more subjective feeling of intoxication for the same dose. Now Griffith Edwards, a grand authority in this field, writing in the BMJ in 1976, this paper is really quite quaint. And what he's doing here is really elaborating what came to be DSM-3, I guess, looking at what the real essential features of alcohol dependence were. Narrowing of repertory, salience, tolerance and withdrawal, relief or avoidance of withdrawal by further drinking, awareness of a compulsion to drink, which wasn't in DSM-4 but it's come back in DSM-5, and reinstatement, and that doesn't really feature because it kind of suggests a past history with a relapse to use. Lovely discussion of tremor. Nicely illustrates it's a range of experience that is the real stuff of the patient's report. And I won't read it all. The clinician has to cultivate an awareness of something equivalent to the Beaufort scale for wind strength and look for the patient saying he's given up drinking his morning tea from a cup because it rattles against the saucer and he's changed to a mug. He's given up an ordinary razor for an electric razor, or in an extreme case he's forced to rely on the kindness of the barmaid to lift the day's first pint to his lips. Isn't that just beautiful? Why don't you see that in journals today? The other symptoms of withdrawal were, as well as tremor, nausea, sweating and mood disturbance. So next time we write about tremor, we really must question, do they still drink their tea from a cup and saucer, or do they use a mug? Okay, I expect to see that in the charts. Now this is fascinating, really fascinating. So 1969, treatment of alcohol and drug withdrawal, 4 different drugs. They had a placebo, that's really good. Chlordiazepoxide, one of the first benzos, Librium. Thiamine on its own. Chlorpromazine, antipsychotic, which lowers the seizure threshold. Hydroxyzine, which is an antihistamine. So those 4 drugs. Once again, it was the veterans, you know, they're kind of a disposable resource out there. You can use them for anything you want, and if a few come to grief, well, it doesn't really matter. On the wards in the past, they'd use barbiturates. They're very dangerous because they've got a low therapeutic ratio. Rezapine, which is an very old antihypertensive, and chlorpromazine, which, as we've said, lowers the seizure threshold. They did know that benzos reduce seizures and the progression to delirium tremens. And they also showed that chlorpromazine increased seizures. While the placebo improved anxiety and tremor, it didn't influence seizures or DTs, which kind of figures, doesn't it? Because if people feel in a calm, supported environment and they've been given something, you can imagine they might feel a bit better, but it wouldn't necessarily stop them seizing. They had good set of criteria to diagnose withdrawal, but they didn't actually measure the severity. So in 1969, they didn't have an alcohol withdrawal scale or some of the other withdrawal measures that have been developed. And it was only 4 years after this publication that 86 out of 101 veterans hospitals were using benzos for alcohol withdrawal. So very rapid take-up and implementation. And when I show you the results here, the comparison of the results, so this is seizures and delirium tremens, so the severe end of the alcohol withdrawal, the complications of alcohol withdrawal. Placebo, the rate for seizures, about 7%, and DTs just over 5%. Chlorpromazine, much higher, double the rate of seizures. Hydroxyzine, slightly increased rate. Thiamine, almost no difference from placebo. And look at the effects of diazepam, chlordiazepoxide, Librium. Fantastic. So in a very rigorous, with a big study, they proved conclusively that benzos are the treatment of choice for alcohol withdrawal. Now, since then, we've come to a greater understanding of the alcohol withdrawal state, and we realise that sometimes use of an antipsychotic to complement a benzo may be helpful. And so there's been a bit more developments on top of this, but this was really the lead in determining the very major use of benzos for this purpose. Now, it's 80 years since disulfiram was first used, or first described as a possible treatment for alcohol dependence by Dr. Williams, an occupational physician in the US. His writing didn't get very far, so Denmark rediscovered it in 1947. It was only in 1952 that the first death was reported. And this was a patient, on day 1 he received 2 grams. The normal dose we use nowadays is 200 milligrams. Then on day 2, 1.5 grams, day 3, 1 gram, and day 4, 0.5 grams. 4 hours after that final dose, he was given 30 mils of whiskey. And 4 hours later, he died from a disulfiram alcohol interaction. So nowadays our doses are much lower than that, and we don't routinely do the challenge, the alcohol challenge in clinic, which they used to do in the UK. I remember hearing they gave, on a Friday afternoon, they would serve people on the disulfiram a measure of gin, so they knew what would happen if they were wicked enough to drink alcohol. So here we have in 1986 a study of disulfiram to treat alcoholism, 605 patients. Did I say 1986? Yes. And they had a very interesting idea that they'd prepare some 1 milligram disulfiram tablets. So they could say they were getting an active treatment, but of course it was way too low a dose to be a proper treatment. They supported it with counselling. You could go to AA and you wanted. They use some advances here in trial design. They used biological markers. They did urine testing. They collaborated, so they talked to family and so forth, and did a survival analysis, i.e. how long people had to go before they resumed drinking alcohol. Terrible adherence and no difference in time to alcohol for any of the 3 groups. So a later study in 1992 showed that if you actually supervise the dose, maybe twice a week, you can give the dose 3 days worth once and 4 days the other. When you're supervising someone twice a week, you get a better result, as you'd expect. However, this has really never been much improved, and it's why the PBS doesn't subsidise disulfiram. If patients are going to go on it, they have to pay for it themselves. This was from a journal talking about 20 studies which have really influenced the history of our area. And I just thought sometimes things don't change very much. So prevention of alcohol misuse, a review of health promotion efforts among American Indians. Important concepts providing health promotion services to this population are cultural relevance must be carefully planned and monitored. Individuals in the local community must be involved. The drunken Indian stereotype must be addressed. Community empowerment should be an important goal. So that was back in 1995, and unfortunately I don't think we've got much further on than that, have we? So those lessons have been around for a long time. Okay, tobacco is the final topic. Notice the date 1962, Smoking and Health, a report of the Royal College of Physicians in the UK on smoking in relation to cancer of the lung and other diseases. Smokers tend to be more restless, less dependable and more neurotic than non-smokers. Cigarette smokers are more extrovert than non-smokers, pipe smokers more introverted. The tendency to smoke may be partly inborn, is shown by studies of smoking habits of twins. Smokers may be addicted to nicotine. Well, that's a good first step, isn't it? They may wish to stop smoking for a variety of reasons, chiefly because of expense. That's more and more true these days, isn't it? Or fear of ill health. It appears social factors play a bigger part in maintaining the smoking habit. And here I'm surprised, this is really quite enlightened. Possible action by government, education of the public, especially school children, although we know if you just talk about the dangers you can make things much worse. Restrictions on the sale, now that is very important. Restriction on advertising, again that's Empower, the WHO move that about 10 years ago, trying to get governments to really take the smoking cessation stuff seriously. Restricting smoking in public places, increasing tax on cigarettes, informing purchasers of the tar and nicotine content, and investigating the value of anti-smoking clinics. So back in 1962, I think that was really quite forward-looking. So I was impressed by the Royal College of Physicians. Now, the report of the Surgeon General to the Public Health Service from the US. The current Surgeon General, well, there isn't one because he or she has just been sacked by Trump because of being an Obama appointee. That's just not allowed. 1964, so they were 2 years late. It was a much bigger report, so instead of being 81 pages, this is 360 pages odd. 380 pages, sorry. The tobacco habit and nicotine. The habitual use of tobacco is related primarily to psychological and social drives, reinforced and perpetuated by the pharmacological action of nicotine. Well, I suppose that's reasonable. Social stimulation appears to play a role. No scientific evidence supports the popular hypothesis that smoking among adolescents is an expression of rebellion against authority. It's weird, the stuff they come up with. The overwhelming evidence indicates that smoking, its beginning and its habituation, and occasionally discontinuation, is to a very large extent psychologically and socially determined. Well, if you think of the social networks that we got from Framlingham, showing the connectedness of non-smokers, the influence of spouses, work colleagues on the likelihood of an individual to quit, that is incredibly true. This is the most beautiful elephant of all, the Banksy decorated elephant, the elephant in the room. Now, this is fascinating. This is the Woolly Mammoth Award. Medical perspective requires recognition of significant beneficial effects of smoking, primarily in the area of mental health. These benefits originate in a psychogenic search for contentment and are measurable only in terms of individual behaviour. Since no means of quantificating those benefits is apparent, the committee finds no basis for a judgment which would weigh benefits versus hazards of smoking as it may apply to the general population. Isn't that an amazing statement? So people with mental illness were benefiting from smoking. More theories. Psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalysts have advanced the hypothesis that smoking, like thumb-sucking, is a regressive oral activity related to the infant's pleasure at his mother's breast. It's claimed that male thumbsuckers are very likely to smoke and drink in later years. The frequently observed fact that those who stop smoking show increased food consumption, weight gains, and use of chewing gum also supports the oral hypothesis. It's amazing. And then there's another chapter on the morphological constitution of smokers, what they look like. So I think you would all agree that deserves the Woolly Mammoth Award in this Elephants in the Room. Bogey died from esophageal cancer, poor fellow, early 50s. Now this is the 50-year study, and I have talked about this before, so this is maybe a revision for some of you. Thanks for listening. They had 34,400 doctor recruits, only 17% of whom were lifelong non-smokers. They saw effects from quitting after only 4 years, they then followed people 10, 20, 40, 50 years, and the benefits increased and increased. They had an amazing follow-up, more than 99%. By 2001, 25,000, so 74% of their sample had died. In almost all cases, the cause of death was documented, and they used 11 categories of death. A quarter of the deaths were lung cancer. 2 doctors died from smoking in bed, and you remember that song by Nina Simone, which came out in 1959, reminding us of the perils of smoking in bed. I won't sing it for you now. Have you not? Oh, it's fantastic. I'll have to find it. Remember that in 1939, conscripts were given ample supplies of tobacco, so it was kind of part of the ration. And this helped establish a generation with a heavy smoking habit from late adolescence. Remember, though, until 3 years ago, part of your entry kit when you went into a Queensland jail was a pack of old, what's it called, that dreadful stuff? Yes.
Red Ox.
Thanks, White Ox. Yeah, White Ox, sorry about that. White Ox, which it came out of the first pay that you got, so you had to pay for it, but they were handing it to you on day one. Even in the 80s, the effects of smoking on mortality were grossly underestimated. The percentage of current smokers dying has been steadily increasing. So Dole and Peto prefer to say half smokers will die from a smoking-related disease, though others have put that as much as 2/3. It's a lot, anyway. Now, this is a very powerful way of presenting the data. So this is 2 cohorts of doctors, those born in the old 19th century, showing that smoking with generally pipes or cigars was much more likely than cigarettes. Certainly had an influence on mortality. This curve shows the early loss of life, and the gap here is, so what can we say, percentage of surviving the age 60. So 82 survived to 60 here as against 68. But if you then look at the cohort from 1900 to 1930, when the cigarette machines had taken off, so mass production of cigarettes meant the market could be flooded and there was no controls on advertising. By that time, the effect, the widening of this gap had grown significantly. So here we have 85%, 86% survival at 70, compared with 71% survival in cigarette smokers. So a growing gap between the smokers and the non-smokers. And these 4 graphs, they're perhaps a little difficult to see, but they show the benefits of survival in people who quit smoking. So if you quit before the age of 34, your survival curve compared with the continuous smokers is more or less that of the non-smoker. If you do it before 44, 35 to 44, then there's a bit of a differential. By the time 45 to 54, the differential gets bigger from those who continue to smoke. And then 55 to 64, you're much more taking on the shape of this curve. So really most of the disease related to smoking takes 30 or 40 years to develop. The messages we get: the typical smoker loses 10 to 11 years of their life. From the age of 35, for each year you continue to smoke, the smoker loses 3 years of life expectancy. Smoking is the single largest avoidable cause of morbidity and mortality. There is no safe threshold, and particularly for the cancers caused by tobacco, there's a clear dose-response relationship. So the more you smoke, the more likely you are to get a smoking-related cancer. Quitting at any age, the younger the better, of course, soon produces measurable survival benefits. Public health approaches, as we see, were really understood back in the early 60s, and it's a pity they took so long to be implemented. Audrey Hepburn, Breakfast at Tiffany's, 1961. Doesn't look so glamorous anymore, does it? Although that dress is amazing. So finally, this is the end of the talk. Thanks very much. Harms of smoking were well described back in the late 50s, early 60s, so it's remarkable that it's had such an ability to hang on. That we must give credit to the tobacco companies, because they've been extremely successful in promoting their products. And of course, the more regulation, the more plain packaging spreads around the world, the more they focus on developing countries with a less advanced public health system. I think we should all appreciate the way we approach our patients today reflects much past trial and error, when we tried shouting at them and were able to prove that a year later they were drinking more. So telling them to stop drinking is not a very effective intervention. Outcomes, we now realise from motivational interviewing, are similar to other current therapeutic approaches. So what is the secret of that relationship between health practitioner, between clinician and patient? There's a lot still to unpack in that. The therapeutic alliance, though, that relationship is still at the centre of what's happening to assist the patient in their recovery. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. So we have time for questions, so we'll start with questions in the room.
Jeremy, your presentation reminds me of the Cancer Council ad, which was actually banned after one showing only on national television. And Philip Adams did it about 40 years ago, and he reshot a Marlboro Man ad, but in the Victorian High Country. But when they reached for a cigarette, instead of reaching for a cigarette, they were putting a dummy in their mouth. And WD and H.O. Wills, of course, took them to court immediately, which is why it was only
for infringement.
The infringement at the end of the ad, from memory, I think, was it's not all just about the cigarette.
Well, there's time for that sort of thing to come back, I reckon. Because humour is a very powerful weapon, isn't it? And making people feel foolish, or perhaps that just causes them to shut their minds. We know that reasoned argument doesn't always prevail.